Hello and welcome everybody. Today, on behalf of Glasgow, England Criminal Justice Group, I've got the pleasure of speaking with a really inspirational individual whose work has sparked vital conversations about poverty, inequality and social justice. Darren McGarvey is a Scottish rapper, author and social commentator. He's best known for his critically acclaimed book, Poverty Safari, which offers a raw and deeply personal exploration of life in deprived and disenfranchised communities. Drawing from his own experiences of growing up in Glasgow, Darren has become a powerful voice on issues of social inequality, mental health, and the challenges faced by those marginalised by society. Darren's unique perspective bridges the gap between lived experience and academic discourse, making him a leading figure in discussions around social work, criminal justice, government policy, and other relevant areas. I first came across Darren's work on the BBC documentary The State We Are In and the episode on justice specifically, which blew me away in terms of its gold standard investigative journalism and realism based on my own professional experiences of working in criminal justice and youth justice. Through his writing, music and public speaking, Darren challenges us to rethink how we address the root causes of crime, poverty and social exclusion. His insights are not just informed by his past, but are also grounded in a deep commitment to advocacy and change. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Darren McGarvey. Hi, Darren.
Hello, Wayne. Nice to meet you. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, really good to meet you. And it's been really enlightening for me to kind of explore your work. Darren, I'll get straight to my questions if that's okay. And I'd like to ask, from your upbringing in Glasgow, do you think that social workers and criminal justice professionals are properly equipped to address the root causes of poverty and crime, or are we just treating the symptoms of failed government policies?
In my view, no matter how well resourced social work and criminal justice are, the root causes are economic. And unless you are given police, lawyers, courts, legislators, and social workers a kind of seat at the table in terms of what a country's industrial strategy is, what its social and cultural objectives are, then you're always, in a way, leaving people to deal with symptoms, which obviously is an important role. But ultimately, we see the problems replicated on such a scale now that it's only a matter of time before it has to be confronted. And this is a problem, certainly in kind of Europe, in terms of the Western world, that Britain is uniquely afflicted by, because Britain, out of all of the social democracies, whether you're talking about Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Britain has a far stricter adherence to the kind of neoliberal ideology, which is the free market will eventually sort the problems out. We need the state to remove itself from people's lives. But ultimately, what we've seen is that this has led to a real deep social, cultural, economic deterioration, which is passing a point of no return, in my view, in terms of some of the ways that public discourse has curdled the real deep pathological scepticism that has developed of authority of any kind, that almost becomes self-defeating for somebody who's struggling in poverty, who's perhaps living in a community that's over-policed. So yes, to answer your question, I don't think social workers or people in the criminal justice system are anywhere near as resourced as they should be.
I see. Thank you. And it sounds like it's not just about financial resources, it's also about those moral principles and objectives and priorities as well. Thank you. All right. And in your book, Poverty Safari, and your documentary, The State We Are In, you paint a challenging and vivid picture of life for people in deprived communities and the negative impact of substandard public services on victims and offenders. How much responsibility do you think the criminal justice system bears for perpetuating the cycle of poverty and crime, and particularly recidivism, repeat offending?
Yeah, well, on one hand, you can locate phenomena like recidivism or drug addiction within the prison system, or many of the other things that we associate with prisons generally to criminal justice and prisons, obviously, because that's an obvious connection to make. But ultimately, our criminal justice system is only as good as the legislation that governs it, and it is only as effective as the resources that are given to fulfill those obligations. So we talk a lot about rehabilitation in this country, when we all know from working in prison systems and living in communities where the prison population is primarily drawn from, that there isn't any real rehabilitation going on in any prison. We don't even have drug rehabilitation or detox facilities in these prisons, when we know for a fact that many of the people who end up there, whether it's short-term or long-term sentences, are there because of a drug problem that has produced, criminality or some other form of crisis. And ultimately, the criminal justice system is a bit like a piece of software that runs on your computer. It does what it's programmed to do, and it does what it has the memory and capacity and bandwidth to perform. And that's a job for decision makers, and that's a job for government. Now, we know, because there's a vast evidence base about what works in Norway, for example. Recidivism rates are far lower, and they have a real strong emphasis on rehabilitation. People who work in prisons in Norway are trained as much in psychological dynamic of why a person might end up there, the health dynamic of why a person might end up there, as well as being trained in all of the usual, this is how you restrain a person, this is what happens if there's a fight, all of that sort of stuff. Whereas here, there's just lip service paid to that stuff. We're really just relying on the personal compassion of individual prison officers or individual governors to set a tone and culture. And no matter how well-meaning and energetic, enthusiastic they are, eventually they will be ground down by the prevailing culture, which is, this is really bad, this is as good as it gets. And until really we kind of retool our justice system, where we actually legislate to put rehabilitation at the core of our kind of strategy, then you're going to see recidivism continue. You're going to see almost a kind of resignation on the part of many of the prison population that they will spend the rest of their lives cycling in and out of the criminal justice system.
And that's certainly what I've observed myself in direct practice, as I say, in criminal and youth justice. And also, just on your point there about Scandinavia, and I know that from your documentary, the state that we're in, it focuses on Norway. And as you say, the recidivism rates are far lower. The emphasis on rehabilitation is much stronger. And I can really very much see that point you're making around that rebalancing that in this country, really.
And it's important just to add also that in all of those countries, whether you're talking about the drug reforms in Portugal, obviously these can be debated about how well they've worked out, or you're talking about reform in Norwegian prisons where, the maximum sentence is 5 years for most things. It's important to note that these aren't just kind of wishy-washy, woolly, liberal utopias where everybody just has this really optimistic view of the human condition and that everyone can change. What the difference is in those countries is that political leaders have been brave enough to look the country in the eye and say, we know you have strong moral intuitions about punishment. We know that you believe that a cost must be paid by perpetrators, and I believe this too, but also that ultimately the most efficient way of doing it is to return that person to society, having paid their debt to the victims and the state, so that they can become a normal, integrated, productive person. In the UK, unfortunately, the politics are so fraught and extreme that in almost every area of public life and public services, we are choosing to do the inefficient, more expensive thing because the politics demands that we stay in that cycle of decline. And this is a real conundrum for politicians. I'm not going to deny it. But when we think about these problems out with our own silos in which we work, and we wonder about the bigger picture of what is shaping the conditions We have to consider the political dimensions that are specific to the United Kingdom.
For sure, and I fully agree with that. And I guess a lot of what you've captured there is indicative of the full prison population, which we've been hearing a lot about in the media recently. Of course, the prisons are filling up with this emphasis on punishment and with people repeatedly coming back to prison as opposed to being rehabilitated and, as you say, being productive members of society. So social workers and criminal justice professionals are sometimes seen as opposed in terms of ideology, very much what we've talked about, that imbalance between how rehabilitation and punishment can be perceived and implemented in practice. I've observed some of that myself, as I've said, in direct practice. Do you think there's scope for kind of harmonious and meaningful multi-agency working between public agencies to ensure the balance of rehabilitation and punishment? Or again, are we just being idealistic about that?
No, I mean, I believe, and I can draw from my own experience also. For me, a couple of nights in the cells here and there straightened me out. The possibility of jail time, the possibility of a long drawn out community disposal, the possibility of the sense of shame or disappointment of having a criminal charge attached to me, these were effective, helping me to confront what the root cause of my behaviour was, which for me was my addiction.
Right.
And so for some people, they need that firm, parameter-driven mode of rehabilitation, which is still a form of punishment, but can have a rehabilitatory effect. Because some people, due to the way they're wired, how their social incentives have been formed, their personality and their support network around them, they will respond positively. Other people, they will respond more positively to that more rehabilitation-centred approach. And I think it's the tension and potential dynamism between these two where we understand how there's a symbiotic relationship between them. That's when it gets really effective. That's when you have a dynamic approach, because you're going to have people who just aren't going to respond. They're going to take advantage of people's good nature. They're going to take advantage and push boundaries. That's when something firmer has to come in place, because you're trying to incentivize emotional maturity, which means consequences have to be a feature of how things are done. And so I think sometimes, because obviously social work is in one silo, criminal justice seemingly in another, you have prevailing cultures in both. There's not always great connectivity between the two. Then on the surface, it can seem like these are antagonistic ideologically, but as most people understand, it's usually a blend of both, applied appropriately in specific contexts that elicit the greatest responses. And that's certainly been my experience in my own life. That's certainly what I found to be effective when I was working frontline in the community, when I was dealing with troubled young people, whether in the criminal justice system or on the street corner. And generally that I think is a healthy outlook on life. You know, when you're raising your children, for example, the children need to know they're free to make mistakes, that not everyone gets it right, but that there is a line, and if you cross it, you will experience the consequence of that. And I think that's how human beings are kind of wired to function.
And what I'm also hearing there is a bit about second chances. So when people do cross that line, that, you know, there is consequences, but there's also second chance and a third chance, and it's proportionate maybe to what they've done before and what the consequences have been before as well.
Of course, and there's also, I mean, and I cover this in my second book, which is a bit more like a textbook, so it's not as pleasant to read as Poverty Safari, or easy to read as Poverty Safari. But there's a fundamental question to be asked about the level of culpability of someone who committed a crime under the duress of an addictive mind while inebriated, who also suffers from one or two different forms of trauma, for whom a better way of behaviour has yet to be modelled. And so, in one sense, there have to be consequences, but is that person even neurologically capable of perceiving their behaviour in the way that the criminal justice system believes they should? And so there is a kind of, I guess, there's a lack of emotional, psychological sophistication that underscores a lot of our approaches also, which I think it speaks more to a kind of medieval approach to justice. And if you get to the root of a lot of Britain's public services and a lot of of the principles that underscore British life, including the hierarchical structure and all of this, you see that we're still very firmly embedded in a kind of pre-Victorian outlook on criminal justice. We just have the slightly more modern trappings of criminal justice because we have high-tech equipment and vans and all of this. But right at the core, we're still very much wedded to this idea that you can just punish people to change, and not everyone responds to punishment in that way.
I totally get those parallels that you're talking about ideologically, and yeah, it's such a interesting analogy that. And what I'm also hearing then is the bit about flexibility that is needed in terms of those interventions that come. At the moment, we're kind of almost like a one-trick pony to some degree with the punishment element, and there isn't necessarily that balance and flexibility needed for rehabilitation.
Well, it's like they say, you know, when all you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You know what I mean? And that's sort of where we're at with the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
There are many people working there. We both know it, whether it's from high court judges to prison officers working around the yard with prisoners. There are people there who know there's a better way of doing things. They just don't have the latitude or the resource or the time to implement anything. And that's why we have to look to legislators to really look at the evidence base and be more courageous in the face of certain political demographics to say, look, we know you don't like this, but we think there's a better way of doing this and we're going to push this through.
Yeah, okay. And you know, I'd hear courageous. I'd probably also say more humane in some respects as well, given what we know the prison conditions are like for both young offenders and adult prisoners. You know, the living conditions aren't always sufficient and suitable also. So there's a degree of people losing their humanity once they become part of that secure estate.
Yeah, exactly. And in Scotland, we have numerous cases over the last few years in young offenders institutions of suicides. And sometimes these have been young people who haven't committed the most serious crimes either. So they've had a period of difficulty in their life. This has resulted in criminal justice involvement. And then when ingested into the criminal justice system, the process of that occurring has just been so overpowering that they felt that the only way out of it was to end their own lives. And that's just a real indictment of, you know, every layer of this society, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. You've spoken extensively about the failures of the criminal justice system in this conversation, but also occasions in your documentary. Would you say that that the criminal justice system is inherently biased against people in poverty, or is that just too reductive and simplistic?
No, it's correct to say that, but again, it's about the level of culpability of the criminal justice system itself. It's acting on a mandate it has been given by legislators. Politicians write the law, and then the law must be followed. So every single day there are police officers out there arresting people that they know should probably be in rehab. Every day there are judges prosecuting and sentencing people that they know are never going to get out of prison again, even if it's a short sentence. That criminal justice involvement means the revolving door begins to spin. But the law has to be read, and there's very, very little room for interpretation within that. So it's true, poorer communities are over-policed. Some people will argue that that's because there's more crime, but if it's over-policed, that also means there are more means to detect crime. If you policed other communities that weren't poor relative to the level of policing in poorer communities, and you changed the law to look at some of the immoral behaviour you might see in more upper-class cultures, because funnily enough, all of the behaviour at that level of society that we deem immoral, that's legal. And it's no coincidence that those people write the law. So they would naturally legalise the things that they do that other people feel real consequences for. But that's what happens in a hierarchical, topsy-turvy society. So it's absolutely true. Poorer people are over-policed. Ethnic minorities are overrepresented. You're hearing a lot of arguments just now from the far right about two-tier policing, and they're absolutely right, but not in the way that they think they are. Anyone who thinks that there's two-tier policing going on in this country that is negatively impacting white people obviously hasn't spent enough time in an English prison, because there you really see an overrepresentation of people from ethnic minority backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
That's as a direct result of the over-policing
Yes.
of those particular demographics, as well as the level of poverty and community stress that those predominantly young men are exposed to. Now, that's not making an excuse for behaviour or running drugs or stabbing people or being involved in gun violence. Consequences must be paid, and I spend much time with victims of those crimes, so I always hold that in the forefront of my mind. But it's absolutely true that people from those backgrounds that I've mentioned, they are discriminated against by dint of the economic structure of the country, and then by the legislation that's haphazardly thrown together to try and present the illusion that crime is being dealt with, rather than just being concealed temporarily behind the gates of a prison.
Yeah, and of course all of that is amplified and perpetuated then by the media also, isn't it? Some of the images that we see, social media and so on, and that can really embed some of this negative self-identity and ascribed identity on individuals and communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, for some people, the only currency they have in their community is their name and what they regard as their word and their reputation. And unfortunately, I mean, if you think about it like a video game where you're the protagonist in the video game, in that kind of social cultural environment, your mission is to acquire respect by performing certain tasks. And unfortunately, these tasks that are modelled to these communities are illicit drugs, making money from being involved in criminal activity, always rising to a conflict even when there is a threat of death involved. And you know, this is just fundamentally unhealthy. These are real perversions of our humanity when we're behaving in that destructive manner. But so much of it is fueled by environmental factors that must be considered when we are, as I say, determining the level of true culpability, because we are responsible for our choices, but we aren't responsible for the range of choices we have. And some people are just selecting one of two choices available to them, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear that loud and clear. Thank you. Okay, so to be frank, social workers and criminal justice professionals working in deprived communities are overstretched and under-resourced and have been for 15 years, sort of part of austerity. Do you really think they can make a difference when it comes to reforming policy, practice and education, to those professionals specifically?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's like they're trying to ride two horses with one backside. On one hand, they're in a constant crisis management posture where they're trying to meet a high level of need within the community, ever more complex needs presenting in the community as a result of changing behaviour, technology, familial dynamics. And then on the other hand, they've got to get their political campaigning hats on and learn how to translate what they see in their day-to-day work into the kind of language that a politician will find interesting enough to give them their ear for a while. And that's a big challenge for not just public services, but for third sector organisations who from a distance can sometimes seem too absorbed in the political campaigning side, which elicits scepticism from the public because that looks like political behaviour and politician behaviour, when actually third sector and public services have very little choice but to perform that unsustainable dual role of, on one hand, dealing with the problem they're mandated to deal with, while at the same time constantly trying to communicate up the structure that the problem is constantly mutating and needs new solutions and resources. So I always try and couch my own criticism of public services with an understanding that it's a difficult position that every public servant finds themselves in, as well as in civic society and the third sector. And unfortunately, it's a sign of the times, the level of crises occurring concurrently, which means that even politicians with the best will in the world and a massive political majority will begin to feel overwhelmed by the competing needs and incentives that they can survey from their vantage point, overseeing the entire devastation of it all. Trying to get someone's attention and that, try to get a politician's attention in that kind of environment is very, very difficult. And this is one of the reasons that social problems evolve so quickly and solutions come so slowly.
Yeah. And in the current climate, the current political climate, do you feel that that provides new opportunities then to be able to drive some of that work forward from a kind of policy, practice and education point of view? Or do you feel like it's the same, perhaps, as it's always been, that we're knocking on closed doors?
There are always opportunities in any political situation. The person looking on at the politician will perceive the opportunities differently from the
Mm,
politician. The politician, the leader, they're not just looking at it with their own eyes. They have a coterie of advisors and lobbyists and other people who can get in their ear the minute they want to speak to them. Whereas
mhm,
someone at the social work or criminal justice level has
mhm.
to mount a complicated, long drawn out campaign just to potentially get one light on the cockpit of
Yeah.
the aircraft of a politician to flash momentarily. And
Mm,
it is very, very difficult work.
mm,
You would think that, with a large majority 5 years ahead of them, that the new government would look not only at criminal justice, but would look at some of the determinants that shape a
yes.
person's trajectory, which
Hmm.
means you're going right back to early years. You're placing more support for families that are vulnerable, single parent families,
Hmm.
families that already have a parent in prison. These
Hmm.
all increase the risk that someone will themselves be nominated for police involvement, which increases the risk of criminal
Hmm.
justice. And so the cycle begins. So
Yes.
you need to look at early years, you need to look at education, you need to look at health. And like I said earlier, these are all areas where the people who grow up in the poorer postcodes get the roughest end of the deal. There's a
Hmm.
reason why the prisons are full of mentally ill, physically unwell, poor people. And
Hmm.
it's not just because they have an innate tendency towards criminality. It's because of the economic structure and how that
Yeah.
manifests at the social level. So a politician really, in my view, should be looking at it holistically. It
Hmm.
should be a grand plan that unites a country, that says, once and for all, we are going to address not just the problems, but the root causes of the problems. And we will do
Hmm.
this in a way which is sensitive to all of the different perspectives in play, find consensus and compromise, but ultimately to continue on this path that we are on is going to
Hmm.
be more socially costly, more
Yeah.
financially costly, and
Hmm.
ultimately is going to just produce failure that eventually will overwhelm the society and the
Hmm.
political system.
Yes.
Britain is in a really bad place right now, so we do need visionary leadership. Unfortunately, this crisis, permanent crisis, really does constrain anybody's sense of possibility.
Mm. I really like how you've crystallized that kind of self-defeating perpetual cycle that we're in. I'm sure that'll really resonate with people that are viewing this. So moving on, you've talked a lot about early intervention also, and some of that is about working with people, as you said just then, at the earliest opportunity, where they stand, where they are. But we know the reality is that by the time social workers and other professionals get involved, sometimes it can be too late for many young people, adults and families. How do you think early intervention services can be reframed to policymakers then and decision makers so it's seen as essential rather than just a luxury or a kind of lefty liberal approach?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you would want to get to a place where there was less need for those interventions, because those interventions are, by their very nature, reactive. If you took
Mm,
long term action on the drivers of the inequalities that create the sort of environments that where you see more densely situated problems for families, then you could start to see a decline in that level of need. So it would need to be part of a strategy where you're saying, while we decide what sort of action we have to take for the longer term economic
mm,
structure of the country that drives a lot of these problems, in the interim, we need to empower these interventions to get a handle on the situation so that we can stem the bleed where lives are lost, whether it's literally or figuratively,
mm,
to all of the attendant miseries associated with the sort of poverty that produces the vast majority of people in the criminal justice system currently. But obviously, to a politician currently navigating this environment, that just seems like a pie in the sky
mm,
approach. But
mhm,
actually, for me, I think you could build real political consensus around that, where you could split the difference between rehabilitation and
mm,
punishment, engage the public in a real meaningful conversation about what sort of country do we want to live in, and what do these concepts actually mean? Because my experience is when you go out on the street and you actually talk to people, they're very different from how they're presented in media. If you go, I was out in the street in High Wycombe and I was doing vox pops, right, which is a form of journalism I hate doing, but TV demands that there's a vox pop sequence at the start of any contentious issue.
Right.
And I was asking everyone questions about how long do you think somebody should get for doing this crime, and do you think we do enough to punish or rehabilitate, and blah, 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 blah. And almost every single person, they had a blend of views. They were not driven by ideology. They were driven by the practicalities of their life and what they see, a moral intuition that arises from their experiences and what they witnessed. So you get people who have quite conservative beliefs about punishment and consequences, who at the same time will insist that rehabilitation has to be in place for the people once they've been punished. And this is very rarely reflected in the discourse, because most of the people mediating the discourse have a strong editorial ideological position. Everything's been filtered through that. Then the public engages with that. That reinforces one extreme end of their belief system. And so we never really get to have a proper conversation, which is actually a very interesting, engaging conversation when you can get it happening. So that's more at the cultural level. But I think that the aside from that, my own view is that there is far more evidence and support of reforming criminal justice than there is in keeping it the same. The evidence stacks up pretty considerably. Not even just research conducted within the UK, but also the evidence of other countries that have done this 20, 30 years ago, and the fruits that bears now. But again, I refer you back to the political intransigence that we currently have in the UK as the main stumbling block.
It sounds like then creating those platforms, punishment and rehabilitation, that's perhaps a very key way to showcase that to policymakers and decision makers, that actually there are all these other perspectives from people who are qualified or experienced to be able to speak on that subject.
The great irony is the people who have the most ideologically fixated positions, whether it's on the left or the right, regarding criminal justice, tend to be people who have had no contact with police, who live in communities where there's no crime. And so they have a luxury of holding a belief that doesn't really make a lot of contact with reality. And often these are the people who have the platforms to speak most confidently about it all. And really they're just speaking to other people like them who are far removed with very little proximity to the issue. So the discussion really needs to be led by people who have an understanding, whether it's lived experience of being in prison, lived experience of growing up, being a victim of crime. All of these perspectives need to be considered when we're weighing up all of these different things.
For sure. Thank you for that. I think that's certainly something that as an organisation that is involved in a lot of these discussions at the various levels, policy, practice and education level, that is something that we can take away. I mean, we do create platforms for professionals and people with lived experience to be able to share their views on a variety of subjects. But specifically about the subjects we're talking about, I do feel like there's more scope for us and other organisations to take forward with that. So thanks for illuminating that.
I'll just say this quickly. I just finished being involved with the Health Foundation's Health Equals campaign, which brought together about 20 partners and stakeholders, all reputable organisations who have a track record of working very hard to advocate for social justice in a number of areas, whether it's economic justice, mental health, whatever you name it. And they were all brought together over a long-term campaign to get the attention of the incoming government. They were caught off guard a little bit because an election was announced when no one was expecting it. But this was evidence of the possibility that we can link in with other organisations whose remit might be slightly different from ours, but who have that comprehensive, holistic view of the problem, and then breaking it down into simple terms that a political leader can understand and communicate to other people. So wherever these conversations are going on, it might seem like it's not having an impact, but every conversation and every time that's publicised, that creates a little potential for some connective tissue with some other conversation that eventually will build towards a campaign of some description
Yes.
that has very clear objectives and is very intentional in terms of how it conducts itself in the political sphere.
Mm-hmm. And there's real strength in that unity. That's what I'm taking
Yeah.
from what you're saying. So thanks. All right. My next question is, we know from the empirical data that criminal justice is overwhelmed with people with serious mental health issues and drug addictions that you've talked about, and your own experiences also. If you had a magic wand, what interventions or measures would you conjure up to begin to address these perennial and deeply rooted issues? If I give you 3 wishes, say, what would they be?
Oh, well, in my second book, the 3 main issues that I see, and it might not be immediately apparent to your viewers why I would say these things, but the first one would be that you have to reform the education system and you have to reform the labour market in conjunction with that. These things are closely linked because education prepares us for work, and the quality of our education will reflect the quality of the work that we can get into. And these are the main drivers of social mobility. These are the main drivers of social cohesion. The communities that are the best educated and have the best jobs are the communities that function much better, with less criminality, less traumatic incidents, less social breakdown. And so reforming education, you would have to, first of all, sort of conceptualise what is an education system now, because the world of work is changing every day because of technology.
Yeah.
So education has to get a new mission that takes into account the modern world. Our education system is 100 years old and needs reform.
Yeah.
And as for the labour market, one of the big impediments to working class communities getting a foothold in the social mobility game these days is the fact that workers have been curtailed and hampered from collectively bargaining for better paying conditions to keep their pay rising in line with the profits that they help to generate. And this might sound like I'm coming from a random angle here, but what we're getting to is the fundamental quantum mechanics of the sort of inequalities that we're talking about. We guard against that level of social inequality by being empowered to advocate for our own interests, rather than just being seen as a kind of as a class of people from which cheap labour is drawn, and people who don't comply to those expectations are sent to the margins of the criminal justice system or whatever else. So that's really, really important.
That sounds like trade unionism then, that you're pointing towards. Yeah, okay.
But it's what trade union represents. It's often the trade union is seen as being specifically about workers, but workers have families, workers have children, workers are active in their communities. The more they're empowered, the better pay that they get, the better their working conditions, the more confidently they can face life, the more emotionally available they are to their children, the more positive masculinity or femininity or whatever they can model to the generation that's coming up behind them. It's really key to understanding that this is how you empower a social class. Because currently what we are doing is we are relying on predominantly middle-class professionals to descend into the bowels of poverty and redeem poor people by modelling middle-classness. And that's what poverty society is all about. Whereas what trade unions are about is saying, look, we can take a lot of the load here, but it has to start with us making the money we deserve for the work that we do. Because if we can't meet those basic needs, then how the hell are we supposed to address all these other problems in the community?
Okay, thank you. So I'm hearing that as your first wish then, sort of reforming the education system and the labour market. Let's say that's 2 wishes. I'll give you one last one, Darren.
The other one that I would put forward, well, one of them was more of a symbolic one, which was just about breaking from the kind of hereditary privilege model we have in the UK. It's not really relevant to this, but I sort of rhetorically threw in at the end of the book that I would just bulldoze the House of Lords just as an act of symbolism. And I even said that in a room in London where there was a Lord present. There's always a Lord present in every room in London, as we know. I would look at reforming welfare. I would look at reforming welfare, not just in terms of the current model of welfare, which is really based on the same sort of moral outlook as a corrupt American health insurance company, where the job is to just decline any request for help until you're legally obligated to supply it. That's what the welfare system has become. But also, I would look at integrating health with welfare. So if we were going to sanction someone for not turning up for a compliance interview or a job, job search or whatever, and it was clear that one of the impediments to them getting into the labour market or employment, is that they've got a long-term mental health issue. They've been out of work for a long time. The world of work is fundamentally different to the world of work that they were in. Or there is an addiction present. Then we sanction them. We don't cut their money and leave them to go to food banks and push them further into poverty, which just costs us more. What we do is we say, along the corridor, there's a mental health professional. Along the corridor, there's an addiction worker. Along the end of that hall from here, there's a 12-step mutual aid group. Your sanction is that you've got to go and attend that. And you've got to go and get a grip on understanding what the root of your problem is. And when you're ready to work within, obviously, a reasonable time frame, then we'll be here to support that. But we recognise there's no point in you working the shop floor in some spa at 4 a.m. for low pay that's going nowhere when you're actually in crisis, and that withdrawing money from you is just going to make everything worse. So really getting more sophisticated about what social insurance really looks like, that takes into consideration what the barriers are for some people to getting into work, rather than this overly judgmental culture, which is all based on tropes, that's no evidence in fact, that's all just about pointing to the most extreme examples of benefit fraud, and then using that as an avatar to describe everyone on welfare, when most people on welfare now are in work, and the welfare system basically exists to subsidise low pay. That's what I would do. And I've been kind of banging on about that for a few years, kind of hoping the Scottish Government would look into it as we begin to take more responsibility for welfare up here. But it'll be a hard sell for any English politician.
That's a really interesting proposition, what you talk about in terms of the integration of welfare and health, which I'd never heard of before, to be honest, and it holds water, doesn't it? My last question, Darren, is what philosophical or practical advice would you give to social workers or criminal justice professionals working within deprived or marginalised communities or with offenders in the criminal justice system?
I believe most people that are there are well armed with the facts, and they'll know more about the intricacies and complexities and nuances than I do as a passing observer. My call to action for them is always about how do they take care of themselves so that they can bring the best possible faculties to the job that they do every day. Because it's a dispiriting and demoralising experience to be working frontline in any area, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a doctor, a paramedic, a police officer or a social worker. The reason that I make the emphasis on self-care is not this idea that we just change the world by changing our perspective. It's about having the physical, mental, emotional, psychological and spiritual fitness to be able to consistently show up for people who are going to drain you of your energy, to consistently turn up within a workplace that is going to drain you of your enthusiasm, to be able to go away and refuel so that when you come back, then you're not just phoning it in, you're there giving it all you've got for as much of the time as you can. It's absolutely essential that people take time to reconnect with why they're doing what they're doing, and to overcome the wariness and the cynicism and the skepticism that this system almost produces in us as a byproduct of just existing. To be able to just draw back and remind ourselves when we were younger, the more idealistic, the level of energy we had, all the things we wanted to do, the positive impacts we wanted to make, and that person still exists within us, but it has to be cultivated and it has to be nurtured, and we don't just grow out of it. And it's not a maturity to think you can change the world, but there is a practical business of how you actually get yourself into a place where you are in that mindset. And so I wouldn't be giving too many lectures on what they can do. It's about, the self-care. How do we get ourselves into a good space where we're not feeling defeated by everything?
Thanks so much, Darren McGarvey. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. Appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure, Wayne. Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Darren McGarvey for such an expansive conversation.
And I'd now like to share with you an advert from my now defunct newsletter, Wayne's Weekly, which I think captures some of what myself and Darren discussed. Moving on, we'll now have a discussion with some analysis and critical reflections. Thank you for viewing that interview with Darren McGarvey and myself. I now have Caroline Bald, who is co-chair of the Glasgow, England Criminal Justice Group, and Rose Parks, who is a member of the Criminal Justice Group, who are with me. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Wayne. Good morning, Caroline.
So you've both had opportunity to see the interview, and I just wondered, coming to yourself first, Caroline, can you tell us a little bit about your social work background and your involvement in criminal justice?
Of course. I'm a lecturer in social work at the University of Essex, and I've been an academic now this is my 9th year. Prior to that, so I'm a registered social worker, but prior to that, I qualified in social work in '99 in Glasgow at the time when criminal justice was removed from the social education in England, but then went on to have a career of around 20 years in criminal justice as a probation officer and then youth offending manager. So it's been really interesting to me being in the world of social work, but from a criminal justice perspective. I'm now the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Special Interest Group under BASWA, and really my focus is about how social workers are criminal justice workers. So really keen to keep this conversation going. So thank you.
Excellent. Fabulous to have you here, given that background, and obviously you can speak very confidently about everything that Darren and myself talked about. So we look forward to hearing from you. And if I could come to you, Rose, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. So a bit like Caroline, I qualified as a social worker in, I think it was 2001. But actually went into probation practice, but in England. And since that time have held a number of different roles within criminal justice, but became a social work academic in 2005, and have spent the last sort of 20 years really teaching across a range of programs, including social work, but also law, criminology, and policing and probation as well.
Okay, thank you, Rose. Thank you for your introduction. So you've both had opportunity to see the interview, and I just wondered, coming to yourself first, Caroline, what most resonated with you from the discussion?
Oh, it was a really powerful discussion, and I think what most resonates for me was the fact that the conversation considered both the detail as well as the macro conversation. I think all too often we focus on one without the other. So it's very much looking at it from a cultural perspective as well as what we can do on the ground within that cultural perspective. So I thought it really did bring together a number of strands from social work, criminology, sociology, but also social policy. And I thought that was really quite profound. So it was a really great interview.
Fabulous. Welcome to you, Rose.
Like all good students, I made notes as I kind of listened and watched, and I've underlined something. So what really stood out for me was when Darren said, people are responsible for their choices, but they're not responsible for the range of choices that they have. And I think that's really helpful. I come to the work from a radical position, and I think there is too much emphasis on the pathology of individuals and always looking at a very micro level in terms of social work. So, these people have got problematic thinking and behaviour, so let's kind of change them. And I think what gets lost is the broader structural overview in terms of people's experiences of things like racism and poverty and unemployment and, lack of education and all of the things that, structurally make a real difference in terms of people's life chances and options. And I think it was great that Darren acknowledged the kind of impact of neoliberalism at the start of the interview. For me, it was a shame that perhaps that wasn't explored in more depth. But I do feel that that's really important and that we shouldn't lose sight of that when we're doing the work with individuals. I think what's very interesting and echoing what Caroline has said, For me, this is not an isolated issue. It requires knowledge and an understanding of how lots of different kind of professions as well as social work come together. And, I think the separation of social work, education and training from criminal justice is problematic on a whole range of different levels, because, of course, we talk about working with people holistically. But if you start to then kind of try and section people off, it's really unhelpful in terms of generating that broader understanding and knowledge that's needed, I think, for solutions.
And Caroline, any thoughts? What do you think were the immediate sort of takeaways?
It's really interesting because I too took notes, and there was a couple of things that I was like, damn, that was really strong. It was really important. And I take your point about the number of choices and that whole. Again, it's something that our criminology colleagues are so much further ahead in recognising that I don't think has trickled into social work in the same way. And I suppose to bookend that, the part that really stood out for me was his recognition about rehabilitation and workforce and being allowed to move on. And I'm really interested in a new politics of exclusion and how social work plays its part in that. In terms of inclusion in the workforce and representation in the workforce. So we as a profession inclusive of people we know to have limited choices? And he spoke about professions potentially being middle class and being class driven. And we know the roots of criminality. Yes, some people will make a choice, but like you say, majority of it is related on who's policed more, but also in terms of who has access to what. And even then, what I took away from it was about just that general work about those with criminal records coming into social education, for example, or social work employment or managerial positions. We don't have that open conversation. So in a way, criminal justice is, for me, continues to be almost the last legitimised route of exclusion.
And can I just pick something up there? Because I think Caroline's made a really important point. And what springs to my mind is, social work, in a sense, as a profession, I think has really worked hard to include people with lived experience. But the contrast in criminal justice, and particularly around people in prison, is it's almost like, no, you should have no rights, no say, no influence, no voice. And I think, again, helpfully, this is where I think the cross-fertilisation should occur, because arguably, people in criminal justice can learn from social work in terms of the involvement with people with lived experience. But, people are not, in my mind, people are not aware of this. I think it was a very deliberate political choice to separate out criminal justice from social work. This is not a new issue. And so whilst I think what Darren brings to the discussion is really helpful and interesting, what ran through my mind is, I've heard this story for many, many years. This conversation has been going on for a very long time. And the evidence is there. The evidence is well documented in terms of prisons not being useful in terms of addressing crime and offending behaviour. And so for me, you have to then ask, why is it that the political discourse and the media discourse continues to maintain and sustain this? If we look at countries like America, where we have the prison industrial complex and businesses and organisations making huge profits from caging people, we've chosen to almost follow that route. And I think, we're at the point now where our prisons are bursting at the seams. The evidence in terms of Scandinavia and what's called the Nordic exceptionalism and the kind of different approaches there are long documented, but we've chosen not to follow that approach. Why is that? Why is it that the media, the politicians and people want to sustain that narrative that keeps people following those, punitive approaches? So that's perhaps for me why, in terms of perhaps the political role of social workers and the campaigning role, we really need to be asking those types of questions.
Thank you for that, both of you. Really incisive points that you've made there that speak to a lot of what myself and Darren talked about, but also more, really, in introducing broader ideas more specific to social work and criminal justice. So thank you. From what you were saying, it sounds as though the global narrative, really, it's not just UK, around the sort of offender management, that it's almost profitable to punish people, essentially, as opposed to rehabilitating them, which isn't as seen as profitable. It's perhaps profitable in other ways, I feel, in terms of social harmony, etc. But in terms of money and finance and capitalism and so on, rehabilitation perhaps isn't seen as profitable as caging people, as you put it, Rose. So, that's kind of what I take, I guess, from some of the points you made there. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, either of you. Would you agree with that?
I think there's money to be made. I think the markets, it's well documented again from Rose's perspective about the neoliberal turn in terms of the markets decide. So the development, the growing march of the DBS check, for example, the criminal record check, it's a arguably it's become quite a technological advancement to the exclusion of many, and it's seen as very common sense. I think, Rose is rightly pointing out about the US, and it's been really interesting seeing the growth of the abolitionist movement in the US not coming to here in the same way. And the conversations about what we have in terms of equally large international corporations receiving yet again more and more money around electronic monitoring, for example. I would say one of the things that came away from me was one of the things I really want to just also emphasise is that Darren was talking a lot about UK. And I think even though, the water in Scotland is different, and I shall hold on to that fact, it is only a few, an hours or so away from us, and yet they've got a very different approach, such as looking at how, at the moment, that commitment about no child within a prison system. So it's really important to recognise that there is definitely a policy driver in England that's been, as Rose was saying, well documented for some time. But then you look internationally, looking at, and I think it is neoliberal. It's about looking at what's happening in New Zealand, about the withdrawal of school lunches, the further marginalisation, the fact that they've announced that they're going to make sure that people with disabilities have limited access to income. So again, it's driving people away from opportunities for emancipation and moving on, and it will be certain people that fall into that net. Again, what we've seen here. And to come back to the fact that this is an industrial complex in the sense that people are making money, but also it's very silencing as well. So, if you look at the Eastern European colleagues or Spanish colleagues that I'm working with at the moment about the use of criminal records as a silencing tool, nobody wants to put their hand up. I get back to the lived experience point that Rose was making. It's while we've made such leaps and bounds in terms of lived experience broadly, to say I have a disability. Some scholars still say that has an attachment of shame and being able to stand up, but I don't think that conversation has reached lived experience of the justice system. Certainly not in social work.
There's a kind of classic book by Ryman, The Rich Get Richer, the Poor Get Prison. And I think, these themes have not gone away. And I think, again, Caroline has really helpfully highlighted, that shame and that stigma which accompanies punitive kind of populist politics means that people with that lived experience don't want to sort of openly say, I've spent lots of time in prison or on community sentences because of the shame and the negativity and the fact that, we've had governments wanting to deny people and people in prison their right to vote, this idea of civil death that other authors write about, people like Michelle Alexander, who's written The New Jim Crow. And whilst that, relates to an American context, I think there are absolutely bits that apply, certainly in England and Wales, where it's almost like, you shouldn't admit your wrongdoing. And I think this is why the interview that Darren did and some of his work on his series on the BBC, where he looks specifically at justice and what happens, in Scandinavia, if we're always thinking that the issue is bad or evil or problematic people, we're closing off any opportunity or space for rehabilitation, reform, or for somebody just to say, look, I made a really bad decision here at this point in my life, or these things have impacted me or restrained or restricted my options. Let's look at things in a different way. It closes that down, because actually what we're saying is something very defeatist. It's you're the problem, you're kind of born evil or whatever it is. And that limits what we can do. So I think it's refreshing that certainly in some countries they have the belief in people being able to change. But for me, it needs to be broader than that. It needs to be about structural change. And of course, we know that that's the hardest thing to effect. And it requires a lot of determination and persistence. But I think it's certainly worth doing. And that's really what we need to be campaigning for.
Thank you both. Really good points, well made, well articulated. And from what you were saying just there, both of you, I think for me it's really about second chances, isn't it, for people? Third chances, really. And as you say, kind of our mentality, our psyche quite often is that it's quite a defeatist one, quite a pessimistic one and a pathological one, and there really needs to be a shift there. I'd like to bring things a little bit closer to policy and sentencing now, and I just wondered, how did changes in sentencing policies, such as longer prison terms and increased use of remand, impact on social work interventions or more therapeutic interventions with people involved in the criminal justice system, do you think? Caroline, I could come to you first, please.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking these big questions. It's such a gift. So there's 2 points for me. I think there's clear evidence of sentence inflation. I think what we've got at the moment is a current dialogue that I think is unhelpful about this two-tier approach to policing and sentencing. Again, I think criminal justice is a playground for splitting. It's been used, again, that new politics of exclusion. It's an easy hit. That is by political design. And you really do have to wonder, look at, it's not that hard to see who benefits from that. So there was 2 things. One of the things that Darren said was a couple of nights in the cells helped him. I've really struggled with that approach. I do wonder to what extent how many people who did have a couple of nights of cells actually, if he was chargeable, would have automatically been charged. So again, you've got to consider that disadvantage is layered. And I do, having worked in youth offending, we've had, for decades we've had the one night in prison, and it does make a difference to some. But for others, I do wonder to what extent it's a realistic approach. I think in terms of the overuse of bail and remand, I do think that starts with sentencers, but also police targeting and who's arrested and who's charged with what. I think it wouldn't be hard to look at the work of Lucy Baldwin and Shona Minson, looking at the overuse of remand for women. The fact that we had a rather incredible pilot that was done with social workers in prisons, that hasn't been necessarily automatically rolled out across the piece. The fact that it had to be done by a third sector pact. The fact that there's a space there where we've still got social workers who believe, for example, that mothers lose parental responsibility when they go into prison. There's a lack of knowledge. So in a way, what I'm also keen to do is we don't focus entirely on prison. We also look at the punishment in the community. And so that shame of that couple of nights in cells is a sticky shame. It sticks to mothers. I'm not saying to the exclusion of fathers, but it sticks to mothers. And we as social workers are assessing parenting. So my biggest bugbear phrase is the biggest indication of future behaviour is past behaviour. When you've got 20 plus years of no criminal behaviour and yet that's disregarded in favour of this one event, we need to be a lot smarter in terms of how we see behaviours, but also more honest with ourselves, that we see criminal justice as a legitimate means to step in and not practice kindly. So, for example, conversations where so if you look at the work of birth companions and the campaigning work they have done, really strongly in changing the narrative, where social workers have been involved in child removal without conversation with mothers, not providing letters, after the event, removing children to avoid anxiety when mothers are out of the room. Again, that's not how we were all taught how to practice, and not the practice any of us want to do. But there's been a conversation where we've become part and parcel of, and if I dare use the word, statecraft. Where we're performing the role of state within the criminal justice system without considering that ethical position more fully.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, that sort of dichotomy between agents of the state and agents of change, I guess, isn't it? Thank you. Rose, do you have any thoughts around that?
I think, again, Darren helpfully reminded us in the interview about the role of legislators, because I think we have to constantly ask ourselves, who is it who tends to get apprehended, who gets prosecuted, who gets convicted, who gets sentenced? And if we think about social harm within our communities, and particularly drawing on the work of people like Professor Steve Toombs at the Open University, a lot of harm is done by corporate crime, by tax evasion, by companies polluting our environments. And, I think what wasn't covered in the discussion, for me, there's also this link with immigration and what many criminologists are calling crimmigration, because people who are seeking asylum, refugees, they're demonised and treated like criminals. They're seen as the other, they're the threat to our communities. And all of this is kind of, sustained through particular political discourses. So actually, if we start to think about what causes most harm in our communities, arguably there are many people and many institutions that never addressed by the legal system or the criminal justice system. So again, I think that focus on the individual, and sometimes it's about individuals and individual families. That's not to say that, of course, where people have caused harm to others, we shouldn't be concerned with that. I absolutely accept that we do need to think about that. But I think it goes back to what Darren was talking about in relation to the bigger picture, and arguably, if we had better healthcare, if we had better kind of education, if we had all of those interventions and offerings that meant people didn't go down that road of actually creating harm to others, then we could perhaps shift away from kind of very reactive and very punitive responses and try to work with people before it even gets to that level. Again, we don't. We keep that kind of focus on particular people, which has devastating impacts for everyone. And of course, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that when somebody is involved in the criminal justice system, it's not just them that's punished, it's their family, it's their children, it's their connections, and it's their communities. So it's that ripple effect. Nobody really benefits. And so whilst some victims of crime might have very strong views around punishment, and even as far as bringing back the death penalty, that perpetuation of violence and harm to others, for me, doesn't actually benefit anyone. And I think, again, it's something we need to acknowledge and really try to avoid through different policy approaches, different sentencing practices, etc.
Yes, and a sort of ideological shift. And I take your point, Rose, around the discussion not really considering the experiences of asylum seekers and refugees. And one of the things that sprung to mind as you were speaking was that the fact that people in those positions are not able to work and in some capacity be a contributing member of society, even if it's just temporary. And that's something I've really struggled to kind of reconcile with over the years, having worked, as I say, in criminal justice and youth justice, but also with asylum seekers in the past. People who are fit and able and willing to work, but who aren't actually able to do so because of their citizenship status.
And that's a political choice. You know, that is a political choice. And in some places, people are able to work.
Yes.
We arguably could save the taxpayer millions, billions of pounds by enabling people to work whilst their claims are being processed. Doesn't mean to say that we can't then say, I'm really sorry, no, you're not able to stay in the longer term. So absolutely, you know, and of course what's happened recently with the disturbances across the country as a result of social media and this kind of false accusations of immigrants causing all sorts of harm, you know, we really do have to think about what these messages do and how people then respond to that. And it concerns me that politicians don't, think more carefully about what they say when they say it, and the impact. And there seems to be no accountability in terms of, you know, some of these things that lead to all sorts of problems that social workers and other professions are then left to sort of pick up those pieces.
Thank you for that. I'd like to come now to a sort of more novel question, really. I'd like you both to imagine that you've got Keir Starmer's role and you're able to wave your magic wand and make some systemic changes within criminal justice and social work. What reforms would you look to implement then, and what solutions based on all of that would you propose? So I'll come to Caroline first, please.
It's a bit of a gift of a question, but also got quite a thorny side. I would like the government to actually make a specific stand in saying that we're going to make a commitment to using less criminal justice. Can I say decriminalisation as a model? I think any cultural shift like the no smoking campaign is going to take 20 years. But I think at the end of the day, it's something that needs to be done from root and branch, to use their words. So, for example, I'm thinking of the work of Caroline MacDonald, the new co-chair of SASWA in Scotland, and looking at the work of the anti-poverty campaign and how hunger for education was her presentation, where she's looking at the impact of young lads particularly going to school hungry or hangry, as we call it, and then schools calling the police. If I was Keir Starmer and I was having that magic wand for more than a few days, I would set about a pathway of decriminalisation, certainly decarcerisation, but ultimately cultural change. And cultural change will happen when statements come out from the government that don't say they're eating the cats and dogs. The fact that the anti-immigration rhetoric is clearly racist and ableist. And I'd love to see, if it was possible, a move away from the narrative, again this is off piece, but a way of removing that narrative of work ready and usefulness and what use people have, because people are being pushed into demonstrating usefulness to the system. You see it with the disabled community talking about having to go, you know, the length and breadth of Britain to get things like PIP, or the SEND crisis, where they're not getting the support they're legally entitled to. So again, I think it's important that from a government perspective they set the cultural tone, but then make actual differences. So the actual difference I woed like is, I loved when Darren was saying that we have this virtual or actual corridor, where we go down the corridor and social workers work with police officers, probation officers. We need that multidisciplinary team beyond risk. We need it, like, I wouldn't say good old fashioned. It wasn't perfect in my day. It wasn't perfect. However, what we didn't have was, I don't remember having, is this dire splitting, both geography of different offices, different locales, but also in terms of educations and understanding of who does what, where, when and how. We need that Rolodex, again, to show my age, of who's who and which organisation. So we're not reinventing each other's wheel, but also reinforcing each other's weaknesses. We have to have humility across practice again, and a commitment to candour to say where we haven't done very well, what can we do differently.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. I'm hearing decriminalisation and people being forced in a way to become work ready and useful to society, and I get that changing narrative that you're talking around as well. From a more crude perspective, financially, then, in order to move towards decriminalisation, how would you fund that? Just very quickly, what would you consciously decide to withdraw financing in order to pay for that then, do you think?
Well, decriminalisation will actually have a fiscal saving in and of itself. So if you stop putting, I mean, it costs far more to put somebody in remand than any of the services that we could have provided in the community. Obviously, there's going to be a gap while you decarcerate to actually move into services. But on the long term and the short term, it would save money immediately.
It would
I know that
save
this
money. And I don't mean just within the criminal justice system, where would you take money from there? I just mean economically as a country. Is there a specific area where we think, okay, we could do with less of that actually, and we'll put that into criminal justice and social work potentially?
I think it would be the opposite. Take money out of criminal justice and put it into social work. So stop remanding people that shouldn't be on remand.
I see. And you think from that in of itself it will save money?
That in of itself.
Yes. Okay, thank you for that. And Rose, if I could come to you, please, in terms of your time as Prime Minister, temporary as it might be, what would your solutions be or your proposals?
Thanks, Wayne. I mean, I think I would have to say that if I was Prime Minister, I would probably last less time than Liz Truss, because I would come in with a more radical approach, and I think it gets to what you've just asked about the economics. And I would actually be saying to people, look, your taxes are going to go up. We are going to have to pay more. But I think it's about who has to pay tax. So some of these corporations, some of the tax evasion, where people should be paying tax that don't, tax breaks for sort of billionaires, all of those things. If we look at the kind of spread of wealth across our country, there's, less and less people that actually hold the vast amount of wealth compared to people at the lower end in terms of socioeconomic status. So I would actually want those people to pay, and I would then invest that money in things like the health service, and actually would go as far as saying I'm an abolitionist. I think we shouldn't have prisons. And I think we should divest, put that money into what I said earlier about trying to stop people from getting to that point. So thinking about our, education systems, relationships, our cultures, and how we kind of value each other, trying to really recognise the humanity in all of us and not wanting to demonise or other people or, separate people, divide people, put people against each other in terms of, fighting over what appears to be limited resources. I think it's actually saying, there is enough for everyone. We need to value our environment and the community in which we're living. We need to all provide and support each other, and recognise that if one of us is harmed, it harms all of us. It's really problematic for us as a community. So I think, I probably wouldn't be popular, and I wouldn't last very long with certain sections of the community. But I think that's what we need to do. We need to be radical, and we need to really shift and challenge these really negative, divisive rhetoric that shapes our politics and our media. And also arguably get rid of maybe neoliberalism, capitalism in its current form. How much stuff do we all need to have? We're built, and it's a bit like the American dream. We're kind of led to believe or socialised into thinking that we somehow have value and status as people by more and more stuff, so people spend their life working hard to get more and more stuff, or indeed committing crime to get more and more stuff. But we all tend to know that it doesn't really make us very happy or fulfilled. And actually maybe what we need to do, and I think to some extent there is some progressiveness in terms of some organisations that are saying, let's have a 4-day working week, and people need more time and less stress to be better people, to be better parents, to have a better quality of life. So maybe if we could actually, move away from this idea that material wealth benefits us all, but actually think about humanity, positive relationships, quality time, and our well-being, and that may make a huge difference in terms of then people's behaviours and how we interrelate with each other, and reduce the kind of violence and the conflict and all of those things, because we're all so stressed and kind of worried about what's going on in the world. And certainly I know that I relate better to people when I'm feeling happier.
Hmm. I really love that as a note to finish on, Rose. I'm hearing radical egalitarianism from what you're saying there, and I'm 100% with that. I'd really like to thank you and Caroline for joining me for that analysis and critical reflection of the interview. I hope our viewers have enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Wayne. It's been great talking to you and Caroline.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
you both. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that analysis and those critical reflections. I'll now share with you another advert from my now defunct newsletter, Wayne's Weekly, which I think illuminates some of what we talked about. Thanks again for watching.